Welcome to this program, Education for a Digital World, Global Efforts. We shall look at critically in this program, what are the changing education scenarios in the context of globalization? In what way technology is contributing or could contribute to this changing scenario? What is the role of open and distance learning? And in what way open education resources and open sources are coming up to support this initiative? We are very glad to have in the studio an internationally distinguished expert on open and distance learning and higher education, Professor Asha Singh Kanwar, who has been Pro Vice Chancellor in this university, Indira Gandhi National Open University, who has been a distinguished professor, who has been a senior Fulbright scholar and in the Iowa State University, and who has been visiting professor in many organizations, and who is right now the Vice President of the Commonwealth of Learning, Vancouver, Canada, as also Program Director in the Commonwealth of Learning. And she has earlier been an educational specialist for higher education in the Commonwealth of Learning. She has been a senior consultant on open and distance learning to Breda in the African regional office in Dhaka, Senegal, and which led to the establishment of, as I understand, Retreadal in the National Open University of Nigeria. She has extensively worked on open and distance learning, more particularly education and gender, and open distance learning and gender. Welcome, Professor Kanwar, to this program. My first question would be that what are the changing educational priorities in the context of globalizations today, and how do you perceive that what changes are taking place outside open and distance learning, which we could gradually address in this program?
Well, regarding the changes that are happening, a few years ago there was a great emphasis in the developing world on the development of basic education. But now, since we live in a knowledge economy, there is a great deal of emphasis on the development of higher education. So this is a very major change which has taken place. And all developing countries and governments now want to raise the age participation rates in higher education to about 30 to 40%. Because as the World Bank has said, that for any country to achieve sustainable development, you need an age participation rate of 40% in higher education. In countries like India, we have 10% of the age group, 18 to 24-year-olds. In African countries, it's less than 5%. Now, suddenly, since the governments have realized that it's very important for them to invest in higher education, there is a great deal of expansion in higher education. Clearly, it's not going to be possible for them to build brick and mortar institutions. So the emphasis is going to be how will they harness technology to provide good open and distance learning so that the numbers can be expanded, more people can come into higher education with good quality and low cost. So that is, I think, the priority. One of the major priorities for education. The second is that in most countries in Africa, they are now starting, free primary education. But after people complete their free primary education, only 13 to 20% are able to access secondary education because there aren't enough secondary schools.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's another area where there is a huge surge for open schooling. And that is, I think, the next area of phenomenal growth for open and distance learning in Africa in higher education and in open schooling.
So basically, as you say, that higher education is expanding, primary and pre-primary education, elementary education is expanding, and therefore there is a lot more demand for secondary and senior secondary education, and obviously there is demand for higher education. So in this context, there have been tremendous technological developments internationally, both in developing countries as well as certainly in developed countries. What kind of latest technological developments that you visualize which could address some of these demands for access and equity in education?
Well, there are many developments which have taken place in the last few years. And in fact, technology is moving so fast that, earlier when there used to be a paradigm shift, it used to take about 100 years. Now, in every 5 years, there's a paradigm shift happening. But there is also a huge digital divide between the developed and the developing countries. And that is a very major area of concern. For example, if you look at the access to internet, the lowest in the world is Sub-Saharan Africa and followed by South Asia. some countries like Malawi have 0.5% access to internet. So that is still an area where people do not have enough access, and that is one of the causes of the digital divide. On the other hand, Sub-Saharan Africa, there is a huge increase in mobile telephones, even higher than South Asia. So those
even higher than South
even
Asia.
higher than South Asia. There's a huge growth here, but they have beaten us in this growth in Africa. And that becomes then one of the possible developments which can be harnessed as a pedagogic tool. So those are the areas which are accessible and which we can use. For example, in the University of Pretoria, they did an experiment with 14,000 teachers. Only 1% of those 14,000 teachers had access to internet. The rest, 99%, had access to mobile phones. So they were tracking, how they use the mobile phone. In the first instant, for the first 2 years, people were using mobile phones for, logistical information. When do we have to pay the next registration fee? When will we get the next lot of materials and so on? After that, they have started using the mobile phone as a pedagogic tool. They are doing quizzes using SMS. They can listen to lectures pre-recorded. So there is a possibility of using.
Is it possible to provide actual content through mobile technology?
Well, that will have to be chunked. Those will have to be small learning objects. Small 2 to 3 minute kind of learning objects. It can't be major, and you can't read books on the mobile screen as yet. But I think it can be used appropriately for language teaching and other such things.
Given that there have been tremendous technological developments and technology is changing fast, how do you visualize that this could address, and in fact, how is it addressing basic education, literacy, primary education, vocational education, livelihood education, especially in the developing world?
One of the biggest challenges today is that if the education for all and Millennium Development Goals of basic education have to be achieved by 2015, then we have to actually cover the shortfall of teachers. There are 18 million teachers required globally today. 4 million in Sub-Saharan Africa alone, and 5 million in India. So I think one of the key areas of addressing all these things which you mentioned, whether it's basic education, livelihoods training, is the training of teachers, training and retraining of teachers, because in many countries, the teachers who are there in teaching in the classrooms and they are multi-grade teaching, they are not themselves qualified. So that, on the job, in-service and pre-service training is very important. So that is one huge area of need.
Where technology could make an intervention in teacher education.
Distance education, and the distance education by its very nature depends on technology, whether it's low-end or high-end technology. So I think distance education will have an increasing role to play in the future as we move towards achieving these development goals.
As you said, if I link basic education, primary education, secondary education, livelihood education, vocational education, higher education, and teacher education, all are leading together, and I recall book published by the Commonwealth of Learning and Routledge together on lifelong learning. So what kind of linkage you would like to establish between technology and lifelong learning, and in what way, in a broader sense, technology could address the lifelong learning needs of societies?
I'll give you a very good example of what my organization, the Commonwealth of Learning, does at the grassroots level using technology. And if it's doable there, then I think we can extrapolate and have experiments and projects in other jurisdictions. We have a project called the Lifelong Learning for Farmers, and it started in Tamil Nadu. Now it's gone to Sri Lanka, it's going to Mauritius and other parts of the Commonwealth. It involves 4 elements. One is the farmers themselves, people at the grassroots level. The farmers decide that, okay, we want to increase the milk production in our village. Then the Commonwealth of Learning facilitates and is the catalyst which brings together the partners, which is the banks which will give the poor farmers, loans to buy the cows that they need. It will bring together the ICT kiosks, the private providers, who will give them cheap internet connectivity, and they're using video emails because they're illiterate, they cannot type emails. And it also brings together, the veterinary colleges, the agricultural universities and colleges, from where the expertise is provided to the farmers. So if a woman, she's illiterate, she wants to ask, I want to buy a cow, how will I know that it will give me good milk yield? So they will say, okay, you go on the tree and you look at the, these are the features of the cow that you should keep in mind. And this is the way that lifelong learning for farmers is going on using simple ICT techniques.
Since you mentioned about women, one question comes to my mind, that technology and gender. This is just a concern within that. How do you perceive, how do you visualize that technology and gender? How would you like to address that in the context of maybe lifelong learning, maybe farmers' education or livelihood education?
I think that technology by itself is gender neutral. It's only the wider kind of, politics of patriarchy which prevent women from accessing technology in equal measure to men. For example, in Uganda, they have computers for girls after school. But the parents don't allow the girls to stay in school after dark. So they have to go away. So they can't have access to technology. But you have seen from Shugoto Mitra's, that hole in the wall experiment, that when you provide technology to children, whether they're girls, boys, anybody, girls and boys, there is absolutely no difference in trying to master the technology. But the point is that they should have equal access to it.
You are right now leading decisions, international decisions at the Commonwealth of Learning. If I may say that, what kind of newer initiatives and in what way Commonwealth of Learning is contributing towards these as an international organization, even beyond Commonwealth, as I understand, and what challenges that COL visualizes to address this issue?
The issue of technology?
Technology, lifelong learning, education, open and distance learning. So,
one thing is that we need to scale up human resource development in the use of technology. And to give you one example of one of our recent initiatives, it's Learning for Content. It's a 2-week online training program. Anybody from anywhere in the world can sign on, and it's free. What they have to do is, in return for the 2-week training, they have to give one lesson of content as a contribution.
As an open source?
As an open source. And once you finish that, this is on the Wiki Educator.
On Wiki.
So, which is a free collaborative, tool which COL has supported. And once you have done this 2-week training, you become a Wiki apprentice and you have the capacity. This model is very useful because it helps us, at very low cost to scale up this training to thousands of people. And I think that's the key thing, to bring computer literacy and computer proficiency to thousands of people rather than just a few.
One thing that immediately comes up is that the developing countries, even India with very strong IT literacy and IT intellectual property being here, but still there is a felt need that developing countries lack resources. Developing countries also, sometimes some of the developing countries lack technology capability and technology itself. How do you visualize that?
Here again, I'll give you a concrete example. This is a virtual university for small states of the Commonwealth, which the Commonwealth of Learning is helping to develop at the request of the ministers of education from Commonwealth countries. 30 small states, in the Commonwealth we have 32 small states. 30 of those small states are participating in this initiative. Many of these states do not have a university of their own. Many of them do not have trained human resource in online course development. So COL is actually bringing these people together to develop the courses which they need, and they have actually identified 10 needs, and most of them are in the professional areas. They are in the areas of fisheries, disaster management, tourism, areas of interest to the small states. They'll be sharing the resources, and what one individual country cannot do by itself, they'll be able to do collectively. And that kind of intensive training is going on. It can be done.
When you compare, you said, if I relate to that, when we are also having a Pan-African project, which is taking content for the time being, to African Union through Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and largely to all the 53 countries within Africa. If you compare this with the African Virtual University and then the Commonwealth Virtual University Consortium, how do you put these in context?
Well, I would say that these 3 initiatives actually mark 3 milestones in the trends which have happened over the last 10 years. For example, the Indian Pan-African collaboration is the first generation, in which the decision was taken at the governmental level with the African Union. and the emphasis was on technology. You know, the satellite technology and the footprint was provided to African countries to access Indian materials.
So in a way it was top-down?
It was a top-down approach, and it was the emphasis was on technology first. The African Virtual University, which you mentioned, which is again located in Nairobi, Kenya, and supported by the World Bank initially, the effort there was to bring content, you know, engineering courses from North American universities and give them to African universities using high technology like teleconferencing, video conferencing and so on, which is not a very sustainable model and which was very difficult. Now, in this second generation, the emphasis was on content. The virtual university which I mentioned, in which people are developing content collaboratively, I think marks the third generation in this whole development, in which the emphasis is neither on technology nor on content, but on people and learning. And I think that, to my mind, is a very sustainable model. So no matter what the technology is, what counts is the people and what they learn, rather than technology per se.
You see, both, since you mentioned about content to be collaboratively generated and shared, one question comes up vis-a-vis what UNESCO talked about open education resources, and Commonwealth of Learning is talking about open source and open education resource, and Wiki Educator is most probably the best example in that, and within that, learning for content is one of the best examples internationally. The question is open resource itself. To what extent open is open education resource? In the sense that if we collaboratively generate content, to what the whole question in everybody's mind is that to what extent can we contribute to that? To what extent we can share that openly? We say, for instance, MIT or Open Learn, British Open University kind of example. So, to put in perspective that how can we take open education resource as a futuristic and Wiki Educator too?
You know, you mentioned the MIT. Actually, they are the ones who inaugurated this whole open education resource movement in 2002 when they put their course notes available freely on the net. Here again, I would say that that's the first generation, you know, in which you share knowledge. I think the second generation is what the British Open University has done, the Open Learn, in which you are sharing learning. And here again, the Virtual University for Small States of the Commonwealth, I would count as the third generation, in which we are sharing learning and teaching together, because both those things are going hand in hand in collaborative course development. And as you know, that in this open education resource movement, the emphasis is shifting from, you know, any kind of elitism to mass ownership. And in fact, the consumers are themselves becoming producers of content. And one of the principles of the whole open source movement is that it depends on people's ability to self-organize. You know, that you don't have to have a very hard touch and a very controlling kind of external mechanism in place.
In a way, it is a self-disciplined system. That
you know, just when we cross the road at the traffic lights, we don't knock each other down. You know, there is no control over there of a policeman. We simply cross the road from both sides. And we don't jostle each other. We simply go past and we find our way around that. So this is a bit like that we learn to self-organize and develop materials in that fashion, in a kind of, you know, collaborative and joint fashion. So I think this is a very good development for education and even for the world at large, really.
Given this trend that is coming up, and which as I understand will continue to expand in the future, how do you visualize open and distance learning in the immediate near future vis-a-vis this open movement?
You know what Sir John had said, that in the 20th century, when the British Open University was set up, that the biggest contribution of the British Open University was to develop a course team. That was the biggest contribution that they made to the Open University. Now I think the biggest contribution to the Open University is going to be the open education resources. This is going to be the trend of the 21st century. In fact, you'll be surprised that in Athabasca University, they first say, if you want to develop a new course and you want to put up a proposal for a new course, they say first search the web. Give reasons why you
would like
want
to
start
develop.
So I think the trend that we are moving towards, there will be existing materials. There is a course, you know, which the Asia E-University is offering on masters in e-learning. What they are doing is they're looking on the web for existing materials and they'll do wraparounds around that. I think this is very indicative of the trend which is coming forward. And you'll also be pleased to know that in Africa there are 4 open universities as of now. In the next 3 years, there's plans to start to develop 6 new open universities. And it's interesting, that how that model is changing in the future. The Open University of the 21st century is going to be quite different. One reason is that they'll be more sharing and collaborative. They'll depend not on course teams or developing course writers, etc., but they'll be sharing the course development processes. They'll have very lean structures. They're not going to have a heavy infrastructure. They'll have a development orientation. It's not going to be only academics. There'll be a lot of emphasis on livelihoods and skills development. So these are some of the new trends which are emerging for the open universities of the 21st century.
It has been a very interesting interaction with Professor Asha Kanwar, Vice President of Commonwealth of Learning. To share, it is great that she shared her experiences, and we take this opportunity to sincerely thank her to give us very important futuristic ideas about open and distance learning and the changing scenario of education vis-a-vis technology and globalization. We take this opportunity again to sincerely thank her to have enlightened us, and you must have enjoyed this program as much as I have enjoyed. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. I have enjoyed coming back to my own institution. It's a pleasure.